TAE Q&A number 6, sick edition. I'm not exactly sure how this keeps happening, but somehow I have a knack for getting sick right as I'm about to record. Apologies, I'm a little bit stuffy, should go away by next week. Sorry for making you have to bear through it. Today's Q&A is in response to a post that I made on Instagram that discusses the 4 R's. So if you would like the full context for this video, I recommend that you check out that Instagram post. Link is going to be down below or up top. That said, this week's question comes from Elizabeth in response to that Instagram post, who asks, I understand how to use the 4 R's in response to what-if scenarios that I make in my head, but what about when making decisions? How do we stop worrying about making a certain decision and get to just committing to that decision already? Wonderful question, and as usual, to answer that question, we have to dive a little bit into number 1, the theory. Understanding why we worry about making decisions means understanding why we worry about anything. What's the biological purpose of worrying? The biological purpose of worrying, of focusing on something negative, is to help us gauge consequences. That is, imagining if a current scenario becomes much worse in our head helps us decide whether or not we should take some sort of action. As an example, if we have a presentation that's coming up that we haven't prepared for, we might worry about what will happen if we don't prepare and if we get to the stage and we don't know what to say or we fumble over our words. That worrying can motivate us to start preparing. Or if we start experiencing a new physical or mental symptom of an illness, worrying about all of the possible illnesses that could be and all of the negativity that could lead to can help us decide whether or not we should go to the doctor. Once we have all of that information and we've properly gauged what kind of consequences our scenario might lead into, we move into a sort of cost-benefit analysis. We weigh what the positives of making a certain decision might be versus the negative consequences that we just spent all of this time imagining. If we've got all of this information, our brain works well enough that we can make a pretty sound decision within 5 minutes at the very most for most of these day-to-day or week-to-week or even month-to-month problems. For example, if we are worrying about giving that presentation, we don't need to do any sort of deep research or critical thinking to determine whether we are fully prepared or whether we need to start preparing. In the case of a physical or a mental symptom, it might be a little bit different, but if we've experienced this symptom plenty of times before and it's been fine, or if a quick Google search leads us to understand that it is not any sort of emergency, we can confidently make the decision that we don't need to go to a doctor. Now comes the important part. Knowing this, we can say that any worrying we do beyond those 5 or even 10 minutes is essentially completely unproductive and leads to no benefit. And as you probably remember from my previous videos, all of this worrying has a very serious cost, which is causing our body to make adrenaline, which leads to all of the uncomfortable physical symptoms we associate with anxiety. So to sum it all up, there are 4 really important pieces of theory that we need to understand before we move on. Number 1, the purpose of worrying is to help us gauge negative consequences. Number 2, using these negative consequences, we make a decision. Number 3, we can usually come to a reasonable or best guess kind of decision within 5 or at the absolute most, in the worst case scenarios, 10 minutes. And number 4, any worrying that we do after that is completely unproductive and it actually hurts us rather than helping us. Number 2, the practice. Now, we can use this theory that we've just learned to address the problem, which is that many of us worry for hours about making a decision without actually feeling confident in that decision. Luckily, for this, we can also apply the 4 R's, which are recognize what we are worrying about, respond to the urge to worry further, return our focus to something else, and remind ourselves of our response when necessary. In this case, first, we recognize when we've been worrying for more than 5 or 10 minutes about making some sort of decision. Then, we respond to the urge to keep worrying about it using the information that we just discussed, reminding ourselves that any more worrying won't actually help us make a better decision. For the response portion, we can actually go and make that decision, whether it be to begin practicing or to commit to not practicing at all and focusing on something else. Whether it be calling our doctor and committing to just waiting for that doctor's appointment without worrying, or committing to not calling our doctor and committing to not worrying and focusing on something else. And last, we can remind ourselves of our response whenever the urge to start worrying again comes up. Now that we have the basic practice in place, we can move on to number 3, the example. For this example, I want to use a scenario that I personally went through a whole bunch when I was younger, and that is experiencing a symptom of an illness that I start to worry about, but fretting over the decision about whether or not to go to a doctor. A good example of this comes after I ate a certain food and started to feel really intensely nauseated. Following this, I worried about all of the things that this nausea could be, whether it could be something as harmless as food poisoning, or it could be something as serious as an advanced form of cancer finally manifesting. After all of this worrying, I finally came to the question, should I schedule a doctor's appointment? And this is when I started the cost-benefit analysis in my head. I began thinking through whether I had experienced this symptom before and it was harmless, or whether this symptom really could be as extreme as I thought it might be, and whether it would really warrant a trip to the doctor. In this case, I decided that no, likely I do not need to go to the doctor, but some other people might decide that yes, they should go to the doctor with this symptom. In any case, I recognized that I was worrying for long enough that it would be best for my health to stop, and so I began to apply the 4 R's. First, I recognized that I was worrying about my health and about going to the doctor and whether it was a good decision. Second, I responded to the urge to worry any further by reminding myself that it had already been 5 or 10 minutes and I had all of the information and did all of the analysis that I possibly could to make that decision. Third, I returned my attention to something that wasn't my symptom. In this case, it was just playing video games or watching TV because I was confident enough that I didn't need to go see a doctor. However, if I did choose to go see a doctor, this step would be a good chance to call that doctor and make an appointment. However, after I had made that appointment, I would return my focus to video games or TV otherwise, recognizing that worrying any further after I've scheduled that appointment wouldn't get me anywhere. And number 4, whenever the urge to keep worrying came up, I answered that urge with, I've already made the best decision that I possibly can, there's nothing any more worrying will do for me, and then returned my attention back to that video game or back to that TV show. The first time I did this, it was quite difficult, as it was for the second and the third time. But around the 4th time, I found that I could start confidently committing to the decisions that I made without really having much of an urge to keep worrying about them. And by the 5th and the 6th time, that urge to worry had gone away almost entirely. Knowing that, you can choose to confidently adopt the 4 R's, expecting them to be a little bit difficult at first, but knowing that it will get much easier to stop worrying and make confident decisions the more you stick to this method. I hope that answers your question, Elizabeth. Thank you for sending it. I thought it was a really, really good one and a really fun one to discuss. If you or any of you other viewers have any more questions for me, please either leave them in the comments below or send them to me on Instagram and I will do my best to answer them. Otherwise, I will see you next week when I'm not nearly as congested.